Alrighty, folks, it is officially August of 2024, and we are joined by everybody's favorite director of engagement at Summit 7,
Stop.
Big Daniel Akridge. Give it up for
Woo!
the man himself. Airborne in the background. Daniel, what's up? How you doing?
Oh, doing pretty good. Just jumping in and around sales calls all day, trying to educate people about the glorious nature of CUI and more interesting, a lot of export control conversations these days. So excited to be on and talk about all sorts of good stuff.
That is interesting. You have talked to more companies in the DIB than anyone that I know over the years. I can't remember what your current tally is at, but
right over 3,600. Yeah, so a lot of them.
That's a lot of companies. That is a lot of companies. That is a sizable.
Hold on. This is no knock at all. Daniel Akridge is engaged with more companies than the DIB CS rule allows them to engage with.
That's hilarious. Maybe we can
right now it's expanded. Like, I'm not talking smack. Hold on, no, we're not cutting it. Like, I'm being honest here. Up until about 4 months ago, Daniel Akridge had more exposure to the DIB than the DIB CS program. Yeah. Don't at me. Don't hate me. Absolutely. Haters hit you. Like, it's the truth.
Maybe in the B-roll, we can cut to his whiteboard just with 3,600 tally marks.
Yeah.
So every time he gets off of a call. Well, that's why we love having you on. That's why we love hearing from you at CS2. That's why everybody loves talking to Big Daniel Akridge, because you have talked to a sizable percentage of people in the DIB. You have a very good understanding of the cross-section of what's going on. I always learn something every time we talk. And it is getting towards the end of summer, which means it's time for our annual summer camp themed information webinar that we always do every year. Registration links are in the comments below. I'm sure it's on the screen right now as we're talking. Thanks, Dustin, in the little room over there. Okay, so we just wanted to walk through some of the things that you're seeing, some of the things that you're thinking, some of the trends that are popping up out there, and then maybe we can talk about what you're going to talk about at Secure the DIB Summer Camp, and we'll keep it nice and snappy for the people at home.
Perfect.
So I don't know. I don't think we've ever talked about this. Fun fact, back in the day, like 2 years ago, we were going to start a separate podcast specifically dedicated just to the crazy things that you hear on discovery calls with DIB contractors, potential clients, and the lawyers said, no, that's not a good idea, because some of the things that I'm sure anyone listening to this, sales development representatives working with DIB contractors, know is that people are very open about their level of non-compliance with their obligations, their level of false attestation, if you will, to use a term of art, with their scores that they've inputted, the things they've told the companies. They've taken award of work without being prepared, not even really knowing what their obligations for cybersecurity are. And every time I talk to you, you've heard something good. It seems like on a daily basis, if not more frequent than that. So that's not what this podcast is about. That's not what the other podcast that doesn't exist is about, for various reasons. But if someone were to make a podcast like that, theoretically, what kinds of things do you imagine they might talk about that they would hear if they were like you, hearing from people all the time? Theoretically, may or may not.
Theoretically. So if we're talking theoretically, quite a few different things. So the first one would probably be around the lack of information or knowledge around export control requirements. So on the small side of the house, your small manufacturing shop, let's say that it's more impactful for them, especially if they're stateside, if they're using outsourced third-party MSP or MSSPs, right, that have access to their systems that are non-US persons. So that's kind of one element of it. Yeah. You kind of scale that all the way to like large enterprises. We're talking 100,000 plus people, multinational, just kind of all over the place. It really becomes an issue from an IT administration support problem, because they're doing that internally a lot of times. It could also be using service providers, but then also just the understanding of the appropriate level of governance that has to take place, export control licenses, who can and can't have access to these environments. And then to throw a whole other fun wrench, which has been more of an ongoing conversation the past, I would say 12 to 18 months, is a lot of FOCI conversations, right? So now we have foreign owned controlled or interest, having to have proxy boards set up that have export control data. But now, CMMC inheritance, right? If a company's in Canada as their parent, what does that look like to get their U.S. entity CMMC certified? What can they have for support? What they can't from their parent? So export control is a big piece. The understanding of what CUI is like at all. The understanding of how to spell DFARS, right? Like, I mean, we run into a lot of companies on the small business side that are working these, DFARS 7012 flowdowns, and they've signed contracts. And, if you look at an actual contract, there's, 4 pages, 5 pages, 10 pages of DFARS clauses, right? They get lost in them all and say, I finally won my first contract. I'm going to do whatever it takes to get there. And it turns out nobody ever checks your math around the cybersecurity position that you actually hold. So, helping those companies kind of get through that and be able to maintain their contracts, because here's one thing that is happening a lot, especially when the new CCRA got released in December of last year, that kind of unified cybersecurity compliance NDIA form that was built by Boeing and Lockheed and all of their companies. Suppliers are starting to take this a lot more seriously. And so what's funny the funny thing that I'm seeing is, people are coming to us not just because they think CMMC is going to happen. Some of them don't even really know about deadlines of CMMC. Most of them are coming to us because they're like, my prime is saying my cybersecurity score is too low or non-existent, and they're refusing to give me work. Help me fix this problem.
That's something that you actually heard.
Yeah. Oh yeah. There's one story which is just crazy.
This is a theoretical story.
This is a theoretical story, correct?
Yeah, correct.
And this is actually,
across the bottom.
Yes, this is not a real. Hypothetically, there are stories around, primes basically saying we're not ever going to send you anything else. You're going to have to physically travel to our sites to pick up things in, secured envelopes. Jacob, you and I have joked about opening up like a CUI DoorDash service at some point to maybe facilitate that,
CMMC Grubhub.
That's right. But I mean, and then there are actually primes saying we're not going to work with you anymore because you're nowhere near where we need you to be from a cybersecurity perspective.
Yeah.
And again, if you look at that new kind of unified cybersecurity compliance risk form, it's basically saying, are you CMMC level 2 ready? That's the gist of the whole form.
Yeah.
And most companies are sadly not. Not because a lot of them choose not to be. How do I put this? The biggest problem is there's a financial barrier to get compliant.
Yeah.
Right. So they are negligent in the sense of they know what they need to do contractually. That's being brought up to their attention more and more, even if they didn't find it out on themselves by reviewing the contract clauses. Their primes are actively pointing that out to them now. But it's more, there's now a large financial barrier because they haven't been budgeting for this. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, this is new to the industry. Right.
Right.
And the problem is it's not new to the industry.
Right.
It's been around for a long time, but it's new to them.
Yeah, we were sort of like in a budgeting bubble for years when it came to this stuff, where the DoD keeps saying the rates are supposed to reflect the cost of implementing and maintaining, but since the rates didn't reflect it, they were artificially low. Even if that's only by a couple points, it's still a big jump if all of a sudden you have a bunch of technical and organizational and compliance debts that you have to pay down in a hurry. This reminds me, we've recently covered MXD released this big survey that they did of a bunch of DIB contractors, and their main takeaway from this survey of DIB contractors was there is systemic overconfidence regarding cybersecurity posture in the DIB. Is that generally what you would say you see in these conversations that you may or may not be having on a multiple times a day basis?
Yeah, so I'm seeing all the way from our IT guy filled out our SPRS score and just put 110, hypothetically, all the way down to people actually realizing like, oh, I think we did this wrong, right? I think we actually are, not in a good position. But I mean, when you ask some basic questions around like, do you have multi-factor? What kind of cloud providers are you using? Especially if there's export control, do you have non-US persons without licenses, around you, right, working on this stuff? Within about 5 to 10 questions, I can pretty much attest that the majority of the people I'm talking to are so far off the mark that they're really not compliant at all.
Yeah, and
Um,
it does put them into an awkward position where they're pressured in many ways to put a good score in so that they
right.
keep getting their work, because if they have too bad of a score, the prime, as you said, will just stop sending them work even right now.
Yep.
So they are pressured to artificially inflate those scores. Maybe they don't really understand what that means or what the implications are. So the primes get attestations that say we're good, we're good, we're good. And then when the other shoe drops after the CMMC program rollout begins, they're going to get stuck holding the bag because the primes will say, you told us you were good. There's nothing that we can do now, right?
Well, and the problem with that is, it's hard to blame fully the supply chain
Oh,
itself,
for sure.
just because a lot of these supply chain managers at very large, organizations, they have not wanted to collect cybersecurity information about their supply chain because they don't want to be held liable to having
Right.
that information.
Right.
And now they're negligent for sending that data downstream, right? And so when you
Exactly.
look at the who's the blame situation, the blame is on both. The blame is on the prime and the sub. The sub for not reading contracts, understanding what they're actually attesting to, and the prime for not actually making a very clear path on how compliant they should be, and actually kind of maybe laying out like a roadmap to get them to that level,
Yeah.
right?
So Daniel, I got a quick question. Like, out of these new conversations that you're having, from your from your perspective, do you feel as though the conversations are being forced from management to now have a conversation about the CMMC issue or the ITAR issue, or are they out of curiosity from the client?
So believe it or not, right now, most of the driving conversation is people are finally finding out that there's this CMMC date, right? That the rule is coming, right? So their management's hearing it from up here, although the IT staff and compliance staff have been pushing it this way for a very long time, right? Like, hey guys, we've got to do something for years. So we're actually kind of now getting it on both sides. What's interesting is people are running into cash flow problems, right? We talked about budget, where now, okay, all of a sudden it's becoming a quick reality, and we haven't done anything to budget for it. But the problem that's still out there, which drives me up the wall, is some people still don't think CMMC is going to happen.
Yeah.
They just don't think, their executives are like, we can't risk it because, if Billy Bob's machine shop charges $5 a gizmo and we have to charge $7 now because of CMMC, we won't have a business. And I get it. I get the logic there. But the problem is, if you don't do it, you won't have a business at all.
Isn't it short-term logic, though, Daniel? Because it's short-term logic as of right now. Because if Billy Bob's Machine Shop is charging $5, at some point they're going to have to charge $7 to compensate for doing the same things to stay in the same arena as Joe's Machine Shop, right?
They just want to be on time with CMMC. I think Jacob and I have talked about this, and you and I, Sprosser, quite a bit. Like, people don't want to be early because they can't afford 6 months of being higher and not winning any contracts because of that. They have to be able to fall right in line with everybody else. So when everybody raises their rates, it just looks like a wash at that point, right? And that's the problem.
In agile development philosophy, they have a thing called the last responsible moment for making decisions, where instead of trying to be like, what's the last possible moment for making a big critical decision, they talk about what's the last responsible moment for making a decision that could change the course of a project or a set of outcomes. And I think we're quickly approaching, if not past, the point of you could probably still make that decision at the last minute, but is it still a responsible decision to start cutting it close? But I agree, especially in smaller organizations with fewer resources, there's more at stake for making a decision too early, but there's also more at stake for making a decision too late. And you can't really blame anybody. I mean, if they decided that they weren't going to be an early adopter 2 years ago, then that decision paid off, right? That gamble paid off because of the way that the rulemaking worked. But that time is eventually going to run out for people. But on that note about people are hearing from their primes in different ways, I just posted a question about this on LinkedIn because I was legitimately curious. I asked people on LinkedIn to send me links to any meaningful webinars or information sessions from the primes over the last 7 months since the proposed rule has come out. Because the rule is now with OIRA. I mean, this is like, official rulemaking steps. This is no longer speculation. It's actually moving forward. And I have not had a meaningful link sent to me yet, but I have had a lot of people tell me we're getting questionnaires that said, are you certified? If not, when will you be certified? And you're seeing a lot of that as well. It seems to be a lot of, please check this box to say you are or you are not. And if you're not, please check this box to say you will be and by this day.
Yep. We're seeing a lot of that right now. Because, and this is that fun little dance that primes and subs have been doing for years, is like, we just need to know enough information to know, can we use you when the rule actually happens, or can we not? Because what the primes are doing is they're doing their own little risk analysis and say, okay, looks like 10% of our supply chain can do it, 90% can't, 20% can, 80% can't. The problem with that is the same thing that we talked about with self-reporting of your SPURS score. People are going to say, of course I'll be ready for CMMC, right? Not understanding the lift it actually takes to get there. And that's the problem, is there's so much kind of misinformation. There's a lot of, CMMC in a box, get you compliant in 24 hours. There's this, narrative going around that CMMC is easy and fast. And so therefore they see a promoted ad on Google or LinkedIn and they're like, oh yeah, if it really is 24 hours, I can go ahead and mark, I will be CMMC ready on my Prime.
We'll start 72 hours before and be way ahead of schedule.
Exactly. And that's that kind of this tension is the marketplace is flooded with these, we call them truck slammers in the MSP world, that don't really know a lot of information about what it actually takes. And they're in turn providing a false narrative to executives at companies. And those executives are turning around saying, yes, Prime will be ready in 2 days. You just tell us when.
Yeah. We're getting ready to go to Gold Coast out in San Diego here in about a couple weeks. And I already know what's going to happen because it's the same story that's going to happen the last time we were there. It's a gigantic acquisition conference where all the Navy acquisition commands are giving presentations and all the Navy contractors are in the audience. And when you ask questions about CMMC, the acquisition commands say it's not a requirement yet, which is true. Until it is final and effective, it is not technically a requirement. But the day it becomes a requirement, it's asking to verify a thing that you've already said you did, which means if you wait until CMMC is a requirement to start on that stuff, you're behind the ball by like 18 to 24 months, which is the part that people think they're 18 to 24 hours behind the ball. It's 18 to 24 months, which is its own set of problems. But back to that idea about, there's financial burdens, there's costs, there's hurdles, there's impediments to getting there. You recently did a webinar just about cost. We've done a previous podcast episode just on using the government's methodology for estimating cost and their own numbers for 853 to kind of derive a government style estimate for 800-171. So just very quickly, what were some of the takeaways from the cost webinar? And maybe more importantly, what were some of the takeaways from the Q&A from the cost webinar?
Yeah, so the Q&A was pretty interesting, more so than maybe the actual webinar. But I took what you guys had put together, right? Looking at what the DoD had estimated for 53, then you guys had both done a subset of what 171 would look like from a cost perspective, and then looking back at kind of some old school DFARS rulemaking around, the DoD estimating about 0.5%, right, of your allocated revenue would need to be spent towards, IT or to get compliant. And the hard part is when you start looking at other regulated industries, 0.5% is a non-existent number in other regulated spaces. We're seeing closer to about 5 to 8% of revenue having to be allocated towards getting CMMC compliant. Now, here's kind of the hard narrative or the hard truth around it. CMMC assessors are not CUI assessors. Right. CMMC assessors are assessing a boundary. They're not assessing your data flow. Right. And so necessarily like proving that, yes, you have everything in this nice little pretty box. So when we talk to organizations, this is what came out in some of the comments. They're like, so if I just, build this pretty little box and budget that, 1% to have this box built, but my CUI is other places, our assessor's going to get me, right? It's like, yes, they're going to get you, but it's actually not the assessors that are going to get you. It's going to be the Department of Justice. It's going to get you. So, people are trying to save money. And by doing these kind of CMMC in an enclave, which I think is enclaves have their purpose. We build a lot of enclaves here. But when you actually remove the data flow and the actual CUI from that enclave, it becomes a problem. So a lot of people rush in the enclaves to save on that budget, which is some of the Q&A questions that we had. However, they're not considering the actual CUI and where it lives today and how it needs to be worked with. And they're still out of compliance. I mean, it's like, guys, we're here to solve a problem. Protect sensitive data or don't. Like, that's the end of this. Like, do it right or don't do it at all.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's something that's widely overlooked, is that CMMC is to validate that you have completed one paragraph of your DFARS requirements, which are the CUI protection requirements. The other things that are in there, like the reporting and, you know, the cloud protection requirements and things of that nature, right? Those things are what are grossly overlooked by people, and people constantly think about, I have that that's the conundrum of CUI capable environment and CUI functional environment. And there's a lot of instances, especially in certified spaces, so to say, where there's CUI functional environments. There's two environments, right? One for the certification and then one for the business, and they get the one certified and then run the business behind it. And realistically, that's a bigger problem than not getting certified at all.
Well, and to that point, going back to the webinar, you know, we actually went and did the math and just basically made a roadmap. Like, hey, it's going to cost between $400 to $4,000 a user a year to really do this thing, right? All the services needed. One of the most interesting points to your note, Jason, was cloud providers, right? People are not realizing, like, even excluding the Microsoft Gov Cloud, which is about 30 to 40% more than commercial, but other SaaS FedRAMP solutions are at least 30 to 40% more.
Right.
And so when you're looking at ripping and replacing your infrastructure, have you ever tried to migrate an ERP system, by the way? Takes forever to do. Have you ever tried to find a SaaS
brain transplant?
Right, like a SaaS.
But they're just sitting around. So 4 days before I need to get certified, I'll just reach out to that cool little ad, and there's a guy that's sitting in a room somewhere in Florida that's like, I am ready to get you compliant in the next 72 hours, along with everybody else that decided to wait till the last minute. That's really what's going to happen, right, Daniel?
That's exactly what's going to happen. And that's what sparked that webinar, right?
Yeah.
Marketing came to us and said, we're getting a lot of questions about how to budget, what the cost of CMMC is. Can you do a webinar on this? And so when we pulled all the data together, we realized, like, yeah, when people are coming to our calls, they don't have any concept of a budget for this.
Yeah.
Like, it's basically a new industry to them, right? They don't understand, you know, when we say it's a six-figure problem, we're not lying. Like, we're not making that stuff up. It actually is a six-figure problem, and companies have budgeted $10,000 maybe on a good day.
Well, and on that point, you know, so way back in 2018, this month, NDIA of all people released their own study at the time of the new DFARS 7012 clause that had just come out, and they were measuring people's awareness and compliance with DFARS 7012, originally final rule in 2016. Everybody at home who's done your homework. And one of their main findings was contractors in the DIB routinely underestimated cybersecurity costs by a factor of 10 or more. So it sounds like that's still true today.
It's very true, because again, people are not taking this seriously because there has been no, you know, carrot or stick, right? They haven't been incentivized to do it in a good way by being, you know, sole source because of their healthy cybersecurity compliance. And they haven't been given the stick with, you know, negative, you know, debarment on contracts, or
although
no
it does
longer.
Sound, and this is one of the things I've told people all the time, is that this won't be a monolithic rollout, right? It won't be like one day DoD flips a switch and the phone stops ringing. It's going to be like what you described, where this supplier gets an email from a mega prime that says, fix it or you're done. And then this supplier gets a phone call from a purchaser one day and says, fix it or you're done. And they're never going to have some big press release that said, today we're flipping the switch and we're not doing business. It's too scattered and dispersed for there to be a sort of like signal on the horizon that things are about to change. And so people get caught off guard because it's just these individual interactions throughout this massive supply chain.
And I will say this, and how do I say this in a nice way?
Sometimes there isn't a nice way to say things.
The primes are making sure that their core supply chain has already or is actively doing this today.
Yep.
If you have not got a phone call saying that you are basically critical and that the prime is walking you through steps to make sure that you're going to be compliant, you're probably not as valuable to them as you think.
That is exact, man.
And I hate to say that because I love small business. Most of my career has been spent in small businesses, but at the end of the day, they're going to make sure they can get the work done.
Yep.
And you might not necessarily have to be that company.
And I will tell you this.
Can you yell through the little Dustin door? We need gospel music playing in the background.
Right.
Well, I'll tell you this. Having moderated many panels and having produced many industry events of our own, consisting of representatives from the very, very largest primes in the ecosystem, that is exactly the kind of thing that they will say everywhere except on stage, right? For various reasons that sometimes the lawyers dictate. That is exactly what they say, is that we have reached out to the companies that we are worried about. The extension of that being, if you haven't heard from them, they're not that worried about you. So you need to be proactive because they may not be calling you. You need to be calling them. But anyways, just to wrap up here on a positive note, we are having an event basically talking all about this stuff. We're going to have the great and powerful Scott Edwards talking about his perspectives on cost and budgeting for CMMC. You're going to be hosting a session yourself. Maybe tell the people at home a little about what to expect at camp next week.
All right. So the session that I'm hosting is with a good friend of mine, Christopher Hughes, at a company called Intrepid. He also actually helps another micro business, sub 10 people, called Astra Solutions. And so he's going to be walking us through his CMMC compliance journey, NIST 800-171, export control, all those fun acronyms, not only from a 200 to 300 seat organization perspective, but also as a micro business. How the heck do we actually do this thing when I've got 10 people? Right. Yeah. Having 300 people is one thing. Having 10 is a very different story. So we're going to actually have both narratives. So we're really excited to be able to kind of do this walkthrough from all the way through how do I figure out what CMMC level I need to be at, through how do I make sure that I'm CMMC ready and prepped to maybe go through a joint surveillance assessment or a formal CMMC assessment once those become available. So we're very excited to have them.
That is one thing I've always admired about your conversations with the DIB. It's one of the things you've always emphasized is no matter what deep, dark rabbit hole about rulemaking I'd be able to pull out, you always remind people, even though it's extremely complicated, even though there's a bunch of regulations and acronyms and standards and controls and all that stuff, it is possible. Yes. It is possible to achieve. And we have a large and growing portfolio of companies who have done exactly that of all sizes. Yep. So I'm very excited to hear from them at Secure the DIB Summer Camp. I'm always excited to hear from you talking to clients in portfolio that have done the thing, because we spend a lot of time trying to reach the people who haven't started yet, but it's always refreshing to hear from people who have already done it. So that will be next week. Registration links are in the comments below. And Daniel, we'll see you next week at camp.
Sounds good. See y'all.
Wear your sunscreen.
All right, folks, it's August on the Summit Up podcast. Jason, I have a question for you. Which one of these two things is more believable, that the federal government would admit the existence of non